Sarah Martinez stood at her bedroom window, watching the dust settle on the gravel road as her father's truck disappeared into the distance. At 18, she had imagined many different futures for herself, but none of them involved being driven to a remote reservation in Oregon to meet a man she had never seen before. The arranged marriage had been decided months ago, a business transaction disguised as tradition between her father and Thomas Crowfeather, a Modoc tribal elder. Her mother had packed her few belongings in 2 worn suitcases, tears streaming down her weathered face as she folded Sarah's clothes with trembling hands. The family's financial struggles had reached a breaking point after her father's construction business failed, leaving them drowning in debt. When Thomas approached with his proposal, offering to pay off their debts in exchange for Sarah's hand in marriage, her parents saw it as their only salvation. Sarah had protested, of course. She had dreams of college, of becoming a teacher, of traveling beyond the small California town where she had spent her entire life. But her father's stern voice had silenced her objections. "This is what families do, Sarah. We sacrifice for each other. Thomas is a good man with land and resources. You'll be provided for." The journey to the reservation took 6 hours, winding through mountains and valleys that grew increasingly isolated. Sarah's stomach churned with each mile, her mind racing with questions about the man who would become her husband. Thomas was 42, her father had told her, nearly 24 years her senior. He lived alone on a substantial piece of land with cattle and horses, making his living through ranching and traditional crafts. When they finally arrived at the small settlement, Sarah was struck by the stark beauty of the landscape. Rolling hills covered in sagebrush stretched toward distant mountains, and the air carried the scent of pine and earth. Thomas's house sat at the end of a long dirt road, a modest but well-maintained structure, surrounded by wooden fences and outbuildings. Thomas emerged from the house as they pulled up, and Sarah's first impression was of a man who carried himself with quiet dignity. Tall and lean with graying hair pulled back in a traditional braid, he moved with the careful grace of someone who had spent his life working with his hands. His dark eyes held kindness but also a sadness that seemed deeply rooted. "Mr. Martinez," Thomas said, shaking her father's hand. "Sarah." He nodded to her respectfully but didn't attempt to touch her or force familiarity. "Welcome to my home." Her father stayed only long enough to complete the financial arrangements and witness the simple ceremony performed by a tribal elder. Sarah felt numb as she spoke the words that bound her to this stranger, her voice barely audible above the wind that swept across the open land. After her father left, an uncomfortable silence settled between Sarah and Thomas. He showed her to a small but comfortable bedroom that he had prepared for her, explaining that she would have privacy and space to adjust to her new life. "I know this isn't what you would have chosen," he said quietly. "I hope in time we can at least find friendship." That first evening, Thomas prepared a simple meal of venison stew and cornbread, serving her with the same respectful distance he had maintained all day. They ate in relative silence, the only sounds coming from the wind outside and the occasional lowing of cattle in the distance. "Tell me about yourself, Sarah," Thomas finally said, his voice gentle. "What did you enjoy doing before you came here?" Sarah looked up from her barely touched food, surprised by the question. She had expected demands or expectations, not genuine interest in her thoughts and feelings. "I like to read," she said hesitantly, "and I help teach the younger children at our church. I wanted to become a real teacher someday." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "I have many books. You're welcome to read any of them. And there are children on the reservation who could benefit from tutoring, if you're interested." His unexpected kindness caught her off guard, and for the first time since learning of the arrangement, Sarah felt a small flicker of hope. Perhaps this situation, while not of her choosing, might not be the prison she had imagined. As the days passed, Sarah began to observe the rhythms of Thomas's life. He rose before dawn to tend to his animals, spent his days mending fences, caring for sick cattle, and working on traditional beadwork and leather crafts that he sold to supplement his income. In the evenings, he would sit on the porch, whittling or simply watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. He never pressed her for affection or intimacy, keeping his promise to give her space to adjust. They shared meals and occasional conversation, but he seemed content to let their relationship develop naturally, without force or expectation. Sarah found herself curious about his past. The house showed signs of having once been shared with others. Children's artwork still hung on the refrigerator, and there were photographs of Thomas with a woman and two young children prominently displayed on the mantel. But he never spoke of them, and Sarah didn't feel comfortable asking. One evening, as she was exploring the bookshelf Thomas had mentioned, she discovered a collection of children's books tucked away in a corner. They were well worn, clearly loved, and as she opened one, a photograph fell out. It showed Thomas looking younger and happier, with his arms around two identical twin boys who appeared to be about 8 years old. Sarah studied the photograph, noting the joy in Thomas's eyes and the easy affection between him and the children. The contrast with the reserved, solitary man she had come to know was striking. She carefully placed the photograph back in the book, but the image stayed with her. That night, lying in her bed and listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the countryside, Sarah found herself wondering about the story behind the photograph. Where were those children now? And what had happened to transform the joyful father in the picture into the quiet, careful man who had become her husband? She was beginning to realize that Thomas Crowfeather was a man with secrets, and despite herself, she was becoming curious to learn what they might be. The arranged marriage that had seemed like the end of her freedom was revealing itself to be far more complicated than she had imagined. As sleep finally claimed her, Sarah's last thought was of the twin boys in the photograph, and the mystery of why a man who so clearly loved children was living alone, willing to enter into a marriage of convenience with a stranger barely out of adolescence. 3 weeks into her new life, Sarah had settled into a routine that felt surprisingly comfortable. She woke each morning to the sound of Thomas moving quietly through the house as he prepared for his daily chores, and she would join him for breakfast before he headed out to work the land. Their conversations had gradually become easier, touching on safe topics like the weather, the animals, and Sarah's observations about reservation life. Thomas had kept his word about the books, and Sarah had discovered an impressive collection that included everything from classic literature to modern novels, as well as extensive texts on Modoc history and culture. She spent her mornings reading and her afternoons helping with small tasks around the property, finding satisfaction in work she had never imagined herself doing. It was during one of these afternoon tasks, hanging laundry on the line behind the house, that Sarah first heard the sound of children's voices carrying on the wind. At first she thought she was imagining things, but as she paused in her work, she clearly heard the sound of young voices calling to each other, followed by laughter. Curious, Sarah walked toward the back of the property, following a worn path that led through a grove of pine trees. The voices grew louder and she could make out words now, children calling instructions to each other in what sounded like some kind of game. As she emerged from the trees, she stopped short at what she saw. In a small clearing hidden from view of the main house, stood a wooden fort structure that was clearly built with children in mind. It had rope swings, a tire swing hanging from a sturdy oak tree, and even a small sandbox area. But what made Sarah's breath catch were the two boys playing on the equipment, identical twins who appeared to be about 10 years old, with dark hair and features that strongly resembled Thomas. The boys hadn't noticed her yet, absorbed in their play as they chased each other around the fort. Sarah recognized them immediately from the photograph she had found, though they were clearly older now. These had to be Thomas's sons. But what were they doing here, playing in secret while Thomas went about his daily routine as if he lived alone? Before she could decide whether to approach them or retreat, one of the boys spotted her. He froze, his eyes wide with surprise and what might have been fear. His brother, noticing his twin's stillness, turned to follow his gaze and saw Sarah standing at the edge of the clearing. "Who are you?" the first boy asked, his voice cautious but not unfriendly. Sarah stepped forward slowly, not wanting to frighten them. "I'm Sarah. I live here now with Thomas. Are you his sons?" The boys exchanged a look that seemed to communicate volumes. The second twin, who appeared slightly more confident, answered, "I'm Jake and this is Josh. We're not supposed to be here." "We're not supposed to be anywhere," Josh added quietly, his voice carrying a weight that seemed too heavy for a child his age. Sarah felt a chill run through her despite the warm afternoon sun. "What do you mean? Where do you live?" Jake pointed through the trees in a direction away from the main house. "In the cabin. Dad built it for us, but we're supposed to stay there during the day. He brings us food and checks on us, but we're not allowed to come to the big house. Especially not since you came," Josh added, though without accusation in his voice, merely stating a fact. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to understand the situation. Thomas had children, twin boys who lived in hiding on his own property, forbidden from entering the main house where she now lived. The implications were staggering, and she felt a mix of confusion, concern, and growing anger at the deception. "How long have you been living like this?" she asked gently, settling down on a fallen log to bring herself to their eye level. "Since we were little," Jake replied. "Dad says it's to keep us safe, but we don't really understand from what. He tells us there are people who want to take us away, so we have to be careful." Josh nodded in agreement. "We used to live in the big house when we were really small, but then everything changed. Dad got sad and scared, and he moved us to the cabin. He said it was temporary, but that was years ago." Sarah's heart ached as she listened to their matter-of-fact explanation of their isolated existence. These children had been hidden away like some dark secret, denied normal childhoods, and apparently kept from any contact with the outside world. "Do you go to school?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Dad teaches us," Jake said. "He brings books and we have lessons every evening. He's really smart, but—" He trailed off, glancing at his brother. "But we want to go to real school," Josh finished. "We want to meet other kids and play sports and do normal things. Sometimes we sneak over here to play on the fort Dad built us before we had to move to the cabin." Sarah spent the next hour with the boys, listening to their stories and gradually piecing together a picture of their lives. They were intelligent, articulate children who had been raised with love but also with fear and secrecy. Thomas clearly cared for them deeply, ensuring they were fed, educated, and had some opportunities for play, but he was also keeping them prisoners on their own family's land. As the afternoon wore on, Jake became increasingly anxious. "We need to get back soon. Dad will check on us when he comes in from the fields, and if we're not there, he'll worry." "Will you tell him you saw us?" Josh asked, and Sarah could hear the fear in his voice. Sarah considered her options carefully. She could confront Thomas immediately, demanding explanations and perhaps inadvertently making the situation worse for the boys. Or she could try to understand more about the circumstances that had led to this arrangement before taking action. "I won't tell him today," she said finally, "but I think we need to figure out a way to make things better for all of us. This isn't right, boys. Children shouldn't have to live in hiding." The twins looked at each other with expressions that mixed hope and skepticism. "Dad says he's trying to protect us," Jake said. "But sometimes we wonder if he's the one we need protection from." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. These children were questioning their own father's motives, living in a state of uncertainty and fear that no child should have to endure. Whatever Thomas's reasons for this arrangement, the impact on his sons was clearly damaging. As the boys prepared to return to their hidden cabin, Josh turned back to Sarah. "Will you come see us again? It gets lonely, and Dad seems sad all the time now. Maybe if you understood." Sarah nodded, though she wasn't sure what she was agreeing to. "I'll come back tomorrow if I can. We'll figure this out together." Walking back to the main house, Sarah's mind churned with questions and growing determination. She had stumbled onto a family secret that was harming innocent children, and she couldn't simply pretend she hadn't seen what she had seen. Thomas had shown her kindness and respect, but he was also living a lie that was destroying his relationship with his own sons. That evening at dinner, Sarah studied Thomas's face as he spoke about his day, looking for signs of the deception she now knew he was maintaining. His calm exterior seemed different now, less like contentment and more like careful control. She wondered how long he had been carrying this burden, and what circumstances had driven him to such desperate measures. When Thomas excused himself to go for his evening walk, Sarah now understood that he wasn't simply taking a stroll for exercise. He was checking on his hidden sons, maintaining the secret life that existed just beyond the trees, invisible to anyone who didn't know where to look. Sarah barely slept that night, her mind racing with questions and concerns about Jake and Josh. She had promised to visit them again, but she also knew she couldn't continue this deception indefinitely. The boys deserved better than a life of hiding, and Thomas deserved the chance to explain his actions before she made any decisions about how to proceed. The next morning, she watched Thomas more carefully as he went about his routine. His movements were efficient and purposeful, but she noticed now how his eyes would drift toward the back of the property, and how he seemed to listen intently to sounds coming from that direction. When he announced he would be working on the far pasture fence and would be gone most of the day, Sarah realized this might be her opportunity to spend more time with the boys and try to understand their situation better. After Thomas's truck disappeared down the road, Sarah made her way back through the pine grove to the clearing where she had met Jake and Josh the day before. She found them sitting on the fort steps, clearly waiting for her, their faces brightening when she appeared. "We hoped you would come back," Jake said, jumping up from his seat. "We've been talking about what you said yesterday." "About things not being right," Josh added. "We've always felt that way, but no one ever said it before." Sarah settled onto the grass near the boys, trying to project calm despite her inner turmoil. "Can you tell me more about your life here? Help me understand how this all started?" Jake and Josh exchanged another of their silent communications, then Jake began to speak. "We remember living in the big house when we were really little. Mom was there then, and we had friends from the reservation who would visit. Everything felt normal. What happened to your mother?" Sarah asked gently. Josh's face clouded over. "She died when we were 6. Car accident on the highway going to town. After that, Dad changed. He became afraid of everything, like the world was dangerous and something bad would happen to us too." Jake nodded. "At first it was just little things. He didn't want us to go to other kids' houses or to tribal gatherings. Then he started teaching us at home instead of sending us to the reservation school. He said the outside world was full of people who would hurt us or take us away. When we were 8, some people came to the house." Josh continued. "We don't know who they were, but Dad got really upset and told us we had to go stay in the cabin he had built. He said it was just for a few days until things settled down, but we never moved back." Sarah felt pieces of a puzzle beginning to form in her mind. "What kind of people? Do you remember anything about them?" "They wore suits," Jake said, "and they had papers with them. They talked to Dad for a long time and he got really angry. After they left, he packed our things and moved us to the cabin that same night." Social workers, Sarah realized with growing understanding. Someone had reported concerns about the boys, and Thomas had hidden them rather than face whatever investigation or intervention might have followed. "Has anyone else tried to visit since then?" she asked. "Sometimes," Josh replied. "Dad always knows somehow, and he tells us to stay inside and be completely quiet until they leave. He says they want to split us up and put us in different foster homes where we'd never see each other again." The fear in Josh's voice was real, and Sarah could understand how a grieving, traumatized father might convince himself that hiding his children was better than risking losing them to the system. But the cost to the boys was enormous. "What do you boys want?" she asked. "If you could have anything, what would make you happiest?" Jake answered immediately. "To go to real school and make friends. To play on a baseball team like the other kids on the reservation. To not have to hide anymore. And to have Dad not be sad all the time," Josh added. "He tries to act happy when he's with us, but we can see how tired and worried he always is. We think it's because of us, because taking care of us is too hard." Sarah's heart broke at the weight these young boys were carrying, blaming themselves for their father's emotional struggles. "It's not your fault," she said firmly. "None of this is your fault. Your father loves you, but he's made some choices that aren't helping anyone." They spent the rest of the morning together, and Sarah was amazed by the boys' resilience and intelligence. Despite their isolation, they were bright, curious, and remarkably well-adjusted considering their circumstances. Thomas had clearly done his best to nurture them educationally and emotionally, even while making the devastating choice to cut them off from the world. As they talked, Sarah learned more about their daily routine. Thomas visited them every morning before starting his work, bringing breakfast and checking on their needs. He returned in the evenings for dinner and their lessons, spending time with them before returning to the main house. The boys had a small garden they tended, books to read and educational materials, but their world was confined to the cabin and the immediate surrounding area. "We're not allowed to go past that ridge." Jake pointed to a hill about a quarter-mile away. "Dad says if anyone sees us, it could ruin everything." "Don't you ever want to just run away?" Sarah asked. Josh shook his head. "We've talked about it, but where would we go? Dad's right that we don't know anyone else and we don't want to be separated. At least here we're together." Their loyalty to each other and even to Thomas, despite their circumstances, showed the strength of the bonds Thomas had worked to maintain, even while isolating his family. As the afternoon progressed, Sarah knew she had to make a decision about how to handle what she had discovered. The boys trusted her now, and she could see the hope in their eyes when they looked at her. They seemed to believe that her presence might somehow change their situation for the better. "I need to talk to your father," she said finally. "He doesn't know that I found you, and I think it's time for all of us to be honest with each other." Fear flickered across both boys' faces. "What if he gets angry?" Jake asked. "What if he decides to send you away and then punishes us for talking to you?" Sarah reached out and took each boy's hand. "I don't think your father is a bad man. I think he's a scared man who made some bad choices because he was trying to protect you. But this can't continue. You deserve to have real lives, and he deserves to not carry this burden alone anymore." "Will you tell him that we don't blame him?" Josh asked quietly. "That we understand he was trying to keep us safe? Will you tell him that we love him even though we want things to change?" Jake added. Sarah squeezed their hands, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. These boys had been carrying adult burdens for years, trying to protect their father even as he thought he was protecting them. The whole family was trapped in a cycle of fear and secrecy that was helping no one. "I'll tell him," she promised, "and we're going to figure out how to make this right. All of us together." As she walked back to the main house that afternoon, Sarah rehearsed various approaches to confronting Thomas about his sons. She understood now that this wasn't simply a matter of deception, but a complex situation born of grief, fear, and a father's desperate love for his children. The challenge would be convincing Thomas that there were better ways to keep his family together than hiding them from the world. When Thomas's truck pulled up that evening, Sarah was waiting on the porch, her hands folded in her lap and her heart pounding with nervous determination. The conversation that was about to happen would change everything for all of them, and she could only hope that it would be a change for the better. Thomas climbed out of his truck, dust settling around his boots as he gathered his tools from the back. Sarah watched him approach the house, noting the weariness in his movements and the way his shoulders seemed to carry an invisible weight. When he looked up and saw her waiting on the porch, his expression grew cautious. "You're up late," he said, settling his tools on the porch steps. "Everything all right?" Sarah took a deep breath, knowing there was no gentle way to begin this conversation. "Thomas, I need to talk to you about Jake and Josh." The change in Thomas was immediate and dramatic. His face went pale, his body tensed, and his hands clenched into fists at his sides. For a moment, Sarah thought he might flee or become angry, but instead he slowly sank onto the porch steps, his head in his hands. "How long have you known?" he asked, his voice muffled and defeated. "I found them yesterday, playing at the fort behind the trees. They told me they'd been living in a cabin for 2 years, hiding from the world." Sarah kept her voice gentle but firm. "Thomas, those boys are your sons. Why are you keeping them like prisoners?" Thomas raised his head and Sarah was shocked to see tears in his eyes. "They're not prisoners. I'm protecting them. You don't understand what almost happened. Then help me understand. Tell me why 2 beautiful, intelligent children have to live in secret on their own father's land." Thomas stared out at the darkening sky for a long moment before he began to speak. "After Maria died, I struggled. The boys were grieving, I was grieving, and I wasn't handling things well. I started drinking to numb the pain, and I made some mistakes. I missed some appointments at their school, forgot to pack their lunches, showed up to pick them up late and smelling like alcohol." Sarah listened without judgment, beginning to see the picture Thomas was painting. "A teacher reported me to Child Protective Services. They said I was an unfit father, that the boys were being neglected. They gave me chances to prove I could do better. But every time I thought I was making progress, something would go wrong. The boys would show up to school hungry because I forgot to make breakfast, or they'd fall asleep in class because I kept them up too late." "What happened when the social workers came?" Sarah asked, remembering what Jake had told her about people in suits with papers. Thomas's voice grew bitter. "They had a court order. They were going to take Jake and Josh into protective custody that day, split them up between different foster families because no one wanted to take twins. They said it was temporary, just until I could prove I was capable of caring for them properly, but I'd heard stories from other families. Temporary has a way of becoming permanent." Sarah could hear the panic and desperation that had driven Thomas to such extreme measures. "So you hid them?" "I told the social workers that I'd sent the boys to stay with relatives in another state while I got help for my drinking problem. I showed them documentation that I'd checked into an alcohol treatment program, attended parenting classes, everything they'd asked for. Meanwhile, I built the cabin and moved Jake and Josh there. For 2 years, Thomas, They've been living like fugitives for 2 years. Thomas nodded miserably. I kept thinking it would be temporary, that I'd find a way to bring them back into the world safely. But every time I considered it, I'd remember how close I came to losing them forever. And I'd convince myself that this was better. At least they were with me, even if it wasn't ideal. What about school? Friends? Normal childhood experiences? I teach them everything they'd learn in school and more. They're reading at high school level. They understand mathematics and science. They know our tribal history and culture. As for friends, Thomas's voice trailed off. I know I've failed them there, but I couldn't risk anyone discovering they were here. Sarah leaned forward in her chair. Thomas, what kind of life is that for them? They're 10 years old. They should be playing with other children, participating in sports, having birthday parties, experiencing the world. Instead, they're isolated and afraid, wondering if their own father is someone they need protection from. The last comment hit Thomas like a physical blow. They said that? They're confused and scared, Thomas. They love you, but they don't understand why they have to live in hiding. They blame themselves for making your life difficult. They think they're a burden. Thomas buried his face in his hands again, his shoulders shaking. I never wanted them to feel that way. Everything I've done has been to keep them safe, to keep our family together. But you're not together. You're all living separate lives, connected by secrecy and fear instead of openness and love. The boys visit with you for a few hours each day like you're babysitting them. Then they return to isolation. That's not family, Thomas. They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of the situation settling between them. Finally, Thomas spoke again. The social workers are still monitoring the case. If they discover I lied about sending the boys away, I'll be charged with kidnapping my own children. Jake and Josh will be placed in foster care immediately, and I'll likely face jail time. There's no going back from the choices I've made. Sarah felt the full complexity of the situation hitting her. Thomas wasn't simply being overprotective or controlling. He had made desperate choices that had trapped him and his sons in an impossible situation. Coming forward now would likely result in exactly the outcome he had been trying to avoid. Have you considered legal help? Maybe there's a way to resolve this that doesn't end with the boys in foster care. Thomas shook his head. I've thought about it, but I can't risk it. What if a lawyer advises me to turn myself in and the system fails us again? At least now the boys are safe and we're together even if it's not perfect. Thomas, listen to me. I spent time with Jake and Josh today and they're remarkable children. But they're also suffering. They want to go to school, make friends, play sports, be normal kids. They're willing to sacrifice their own happiness to protect you. But that's not their job. They're children. I know that, Thomas said quietly. I know I've asked too much of them, but I don't know how to fix it without making everything worse. Sarah moved to sit beside Thomas on the steps. What if we could find a way? What if there was a path that kept your family together, but also gave the boys the lives they deserve? Thomas looked at her with a mixture of hope and skepticism. What are you suggesting? I don't know yet. But I know that this current situation isn't sustainable. The boys are growing up, and soon they'll be old enough to make their own choices about whether to keep living in hiding. If you want to maintain a relationship with them, you need to find a way to give them a real life. Thomas was quiet for a long time, staring out at the land that had become both sanctuary and prison for his family. Would you help me? He asked finally. If there was a way to make this right. Yes, Sarah said without hesitation. Those boys deserve a chance at happiness and you deserve to be their father openly, not in secret. We'll figure out how to make that happen. As they talked late into the night, Sarah began to understand the depth of Thomas's love for his sons and the genuine terror that had driven his actions. She also began to form the outline of a plan that might offer hope for all of them, though it would require courage from Thomas and careful navigation of a complex legal and social situation. The arranged marriage that had seemed like the end of her freedom was revealing itself to be the beginning of something much more significant. She had stumbled into a family crisis that would test everything she believed about love, sacrifice, and what it truly meant to protect the people you care about most. The next few days passed in a strange new routine. Thomas, visibly relieved to have someone who knew his secret, began including Sarah in his evening visits with the boys. She watched as the three of them navigated their complicated relationship, seeing both the deep love they shared and the strain that years of secrecy had placed on their family bonds. Jake and Josh welcomed Sarah's presence eagerly, treating her like a bridge between their hidden world and the normal life they craved. They peppered her with questions about her education, about the town where she had grown up, about what school was like with other children. Their hunger for connection to the outside world was painful to witness. "Did you play sports when you were our age?" Jake asked during one of their evening conversations. "I played basketball and ran track," Sarah replied. "I made some of my best friends on those teams." Josh leaned forward eagerly. "What's it like having friends? Real friends who aren't related to you?" The innocent question broke Sarah's heart. These boys had been so isolated that the concept of friendship was foreign to them. She glanced at Thomas, seeing the pain in his eyes as he witnessed his son's longing for experiences he had denied them. After several nights of these conversations, Sarah decided it was time to begin implementing the plan she had been developing. "Thomas, I want to make some phone calls tomorrow. I need to research legal options and find out what resources might be available to help us." Thomas's jaw tightened with anxiety. What if making inquiries alerts the authorities? What if they start investigating? "We can't live in fear forever," Sarah said gently. "And I think there may be options we haven't considered. The situation has been stable for 2 years. You've completed alcohol treatment, you've been providing for the boys, and you've demonstrated that you can be a responsible parent, even under difficult circumstances. The tribal council might be able to help too," she continued. "This is reservation land, and tribal sovereignty could provide some protection and alternative approaches that the state system might not offer." Thomas looked surprised. "I hadn't thought of involving the council. I've been so focused on avoiding any contact with official authorities." "Your isolation has been part of the problem," Sarah pointed out. "By cutting yourself off from your community, you've also cut off potential sources of support and guidance." The next morning, Sarah began making careful inquiries. Her first call was to the tribal council offices, where she spoke with Helen Running Bear, a social worker who specialized in family services on the reservation. Sarah explained the situation in general terms, without revealing identifying details, and asked about hypothetical options for a father who had been keeping his children hidden from social services. Helen's response was more encouraging than Sarah had dared hope. "Tribal law gives us significant authority in child welfare cases involving tribal members," she explained. "If the father and children are enrolled tribal members, and the children are living safely on reservation land, there are protocols that could potentially supersede state intervention." "What would that process look like?" Sarah asked. "The tribal council would need to conduct its own investigation and assessment. If they determine that the children are safe and being properly cared for, they can advocate for the family with state authorities. It's not a guarantee, but it's a much better position than trying to navigate the state system alone." Sarah's second call was to a legal aid office that specialized in Native American family law. The attorney she spoke with confirmed Helen's information and added crucial details about recent changes in federal law that strengthened tribal authority. In child welfare cases, the Indian Child Welfare Act has been reinforced in recent years, the attorney explained. If this family is willing to work with tribal authorities and demonstrate that they can provide a stable, safe environment for the children, there's a good chance they could resolve this situation without the children being removed from the home. That evening, Sarah shared her findings with Thomas and the boys. For the first time in years, she saw genuine hope in Thomas's eyes as she outlined the potential path forward. "The tribal council could advocate for us?" Thomas asked, his voice filled with cautious optimism. "More than that," Sarah explained. "They could take jurisdiction over the case and work directly with state authorities to resolve the situation. You wouldn't be facing this alone anymore." Jake looked confused. "Does this mean we could come out of hiding?" "It means we might be able to find a way for you to live normal lives while staying together as a family," Sarah said carefully. "But it would require your dad to be completely honest about what's been happening, and it would mean accepting help and oversight from the tribal council." Josh turned to his father. "Dad, would you be willing to do that? To ask for help?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, the weight of 2 years of secrecy and fear visible in his expression. "I've been so afraid of losing you boys that I've been willing to sacrifice everything else. Your freedom, your childhood, your happiness. Maybe it's time to be brave in a different way." Over the next week, Sarah helped Thomas prepare for what would be one of the most difficult conversations of his life. They rehearsed how he would explain the situation to Helen Running Bear and the tribal council, how he would take responsibility for his actions while also advocating for his family's future. The boys, meanwhile, fluctuated between excitement and terror at the prospect of their secret life coming to an end. They had dreamed of freedom for so long that it was almost too overwhelming to believe it might actually happen. What if the other kids don't like us because we're weird? Jake worried. We don't know how to act around other people. What if we're too far behind in school? Josh added. What if we can't catch up? Sarah worked to address their fears while also being realistic about the challenges they would face. It will be an adjustment, she admitted. But you're both smart and adaptable, and you'll have support from your dad, from me, and from the community. When the day finally came for Thomas to meet with Helen Running Bear, Sarah accompanied him for moral support. The tribal offices were located in a modern building at the center of the reservation, and Sarah could see Thomas's nervousness increasing with each step toward the entrance. Helen Running Bear turned out to be a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She listened without interruption as Thomas told his story, from Maria's death through his struggles with alcohol, the intervention by Child Protective Services, and his decision to hide his sons. I know what I did was wrong, Thomas concluded. I lied to state authorities. I kept my children isolated from their community, and I put my own fears ahead of their needs. But I love them, and I've been trying to be a good father under impossible circumstances. Helen was quiet for several minutes after Thomas finished speaking, making notes and considering what she had heard. Finally, she looked up at him. Mr. Crowfeather, what you've described is a situation I've encountered before, unfortunately. Grieving parents who make desperate choices when they feel like the system is failing their families. What matters now is whether you're ready to accept help and work within proper channels to resolve this situation. I am, Thomas said firmly. I want my sons to have normal lives. I want them to go to school, make friends, and be part of their community. I just need to know they won't be taken away from me. Helen nodded. Here's what I'm prepared to recommend to the council. We'll conduct a full assessment of your current situation, including interviews with Jake and Josh to ensure they're safe and well cared for. If that assessment is positive, we'll approach state authorities with a proposal for tribal supervision of your family. What would that mean? Sarah asked. Thomas would need to continue with regular counseling and parenting support. The boys would need to be enrolled in school and have regular check-ins with tribal social services. There would be ongoing monitoring to ensure the family remains stable and the children's needs are being met. Thomas's relief was visible, and they could stay with me? If our assessment confirms that they're safe and thriving in your care, yes. The goal would be to keep your family together while ensuring the boys have access to all the opportunities and support they need. That night, Thomas gathered his sons around the kitchen table in the main house for the first time in 2 years. Sarah watched as the three of them sat together in the space that had been denied to the boys for so long, and she saw the beginning of healing in their family. Boys, Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. Tomorrow we start over. No more hiding, no more secrets. We're going to face whatever comes together as a family. Jake reached across the table and took his father's hand. We're scared, Dad, but we're ready. We trust you, Josh added. And we trust Sarah. We know you'll keep us safe. As Sarah looked around the table at this family that had been broken by fear and was now choosing courage, she realized that her own life had been transformed as completely as theirs. The arranged marriage that had seemed like a trap had become the catalyst for healing not just for Thomas and his sons, but for herself as well. The next phase of their journey would bring new challenges, but for the first time in years they would face those challenges together, supported by their community and grounded in honesty rather than fear. 3 months later, Sarah stood at the kitchen window watching Jake and Josh climb off the yellow school bus, their backpacks bouncing as they ran toward the house. The sight still filled her with amazement. The transition hadn't been easy, but watching the boys discover the world beyond their hidden cabin had been one of the most rewarding experiences of her life. The tribal council's intervention had worked even better than they had hoped. Helen Running Bear's assessment had been thoroughly positive, praising Thomas for the education and care he had provided his sons despite their difficult circumstances. When she presented the case to state authorities, emphasizing tribal sovereignty and the family's stability, the resolution had been surprisingly straightforward. The state social workers, relieved to close a case that had been stagnant for 2 years, agreed to tribal supervision with minimal resistance. Thomas's completion of alcohol treatment, his stable housing and income, and the boys' obvious health and well-being made their decision easier. But the real test had come when Jake and Josh entered the reservation school. Sarah had worried about how they would adapt to being around other children after years of isolation, but she had underestimated their resilience and hunger for connection. "How was school today?" Sarah asked as the boys burst through the kitchen door, their faces flushed from the cool October air. "Amazing," Jake exclaimed, dropping his backpack on the floor. "We're working on a science project about renewable energy, and Josh and I are partners with 2 other kids. We get to build a working solar panel." Josh nodded enthusiastically, and Coach Martinez asked if we wanted to try out for the basketball team. "He said we're tall for our age and might have natural ability." Sarah smiled at their excitement. The boys had thrown themselves into school life with enthusiasm that sometimes overwhelmed their teachers and classmates, but their genuine joy in learning and participating was infectious. Thomas appeared in the doorway, having heard the boys' arrival from his workshop, where he had been crafting a new set of traditional drums for a tribal ceremony. His transformation over the past few months had been as dramatic as his son's. The weight he had carried for years seemed to lift more each day as he watched Jake and Josh flourish in their new freedom. "Did you tell Sarah about the parent-teacher conferences?" Thomas asked, settling into his usual chair at the kitchen table. "Oh yeah," Jake remembered. "Mrs. Peterson wants to meet with you and Sarah next week. She says we're both reading at high school level, and she wants to talk about advanced placement options." Sarah felt a warm glow of pride. The boys' education under Thomas's guidance had been even more comprehensive than anyone had realized. Despite their isolation, they were ahead of their peers in most subjects. "She also said something about us being really good at helping other kids," Josh added. "Like when someone doesn't understand something, we're good at explaining it in different ways." Thomas nodded. "That makes sense. You've been teaching each other for years." Over dinner that evening, the boys chattered about their day with the enthusiasm that had become their normal state. They talked about friends they were making, subjects they were enjoying, and activities they wanted to try. Their world had expanded exponentially, and they were embracing every opportunity. But it was after the boys had gone to bed that Sarah and Thomas had their most significant conversations. Tonight, as they sat on the porch under the star-filled sky, Thomas brought up the subject that had been weighing on both of their minds. "Sarah, I need to say something I should have said months ago," Thomas began, his voice serious. "When your father arranged our marriage, I was looking for stability and help managing my situation. I never expected to find someone who would care about Jake and Josh the way you do." Sarah turned to look at him in the darkness. Over the months of working together to rebuild his family, she had come to see Thomas not as the stranger she had married, but as a man of deep integrity who had made mistakes born of love and fear. "I care about them because they're remarkable boys," she said simply, "and because I care about you." The admission hung in the air between them. Their relationship had evolved slowly and naturally from mutual respect to genuine partnership to something deeper that neither of them had expected. "I know our marriage began as a transaction," Thomas continued, "but it's become something real for me. You saved my family, Sarah. You gave my sons their lives back, and you gave me the courage to face my mistakes and make them right." Sarah reached for his hand in the darkness. "You would have found your way eventually. You love those boys too much to have let them live in hiding forever. Maybe. But I don't know how much damage would have been done in the meantime." Josh was already starting to withdraw, and Jake was becoming angry about their situation. Another year of that life might have broken something that couldn't be repaired. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the countryside and processing the journey that had brought them to this moment. "There's something else," Thomas said eventually. "The boys asked me something today that I wasn't sure how to answer." "What did they ask?" "They want to know if you're going to stay. They've started thinking of you as family, but they're afraid that now that the crisis is over, you might leave." Sarah considered the question that had been in the back of her own mind for weeks. When she had first arrived at Thomas's house, she had been thinking about escape, about how to endure an unwanted marriage until she could find a way out. But somewhere along the way, this had stopped feeling like a prison and started feeling like home. "What did you tell them?" she asked. "I told them that was up to you, that you'd married me to help your family, not because you chose this life, and now that things have stabilized, you should be free to make your own choices about your future." Sarah squeezed Thomas's hand. What if I choose to stay? What if this arranged marriage has become something I actually want? Thomas turned to face her fully. Then I would be the luckiest man on the reservation. But I need you to be sure, Sarah, you're young and you've already sacrificed so much. I don't want you to stay out of obligation or because you feel responsible for us. I'm not staying out of obligation, Sarah said firmly. I'm staying because I love the life we've built together. I love watching Jake and Josh discover the world. I love the work we're doing to help other families on the reservation who are struggling with similar issues. I love the partnership we've developed, and I love the man you've become as you've healed from your grief. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Are you sure? Because once you commit to this life, to being a mother to my boys and a true partner to me, there's no going back to the dreams you had before. Sarah smiled in the darkness. My dreams before were about making a difference in children's lives through teaching. I'm doing that now, just not in the way I expected. Sometimes the best paths are the ones we never planned to take. The next morning, Sarah woke to the sound of Jake and Josh's laughter drifting up from the kitchen. She found them making pancakes with Thomas, flour dusting their clothes and smiles lighting their faces. This was what family looked like, she realized. Not perfect, not without struggles, but real and loving and committed to each other. Sarah, Josh called out when he saw her. We're making breakfast for you. Dad said you might have some big news to share with us. Sarah looked at Thomas, who smiled and nodded encouragingly. She had found her place in this family, and they had found their place in the world. The secret that had nearly destroyed them had instead become the foundation for something stronger and more beautiful than any of them could have imagined. 1 year later, Sarah stood in the gymnasium of the reservation school, her heart pounding with pride as she watched Jake and Josh receive academic achievement awards at the annual honor ceremony. The boys had not only caught up with their peers but had excelled beyond anyone's expectations. Their years of intensive one-on-one education with Thomas proving to be an unexpected advantage. Thomas sat beside her, his own chest swelling with parental pride, as he watched his sons shake hands with the tribal council chairman and accept recognition for their outstanding performance in mathematics and science. The contrast between the confident, happy boys on stage and the hidden, isolated children Sarah had first met seemed almost impossible to believe. Mr. and Mrs. Crowfeather, Helen Running Bear, approached them after the ceremony, using the name that still gave Sarah a small thrill of belonging. I wanted to congratulate you on how well Jake and Josh are doing. Their transformation has been remarkable. They're remarkable boys, Sarah replied. They just needed the chance to show the world what they could do. Helen nodded, then lowered her voice slightly. I also wanted to discuss something with you both. We've had several families approach us recently with situations similar to what Thomas faced after Maria's death. Parents struggling with grief, substance issues, or poverty who are afraid of losing their children to the state system. Would you be willing to consider working with us to develop a support program for these families? Thomas and Sarah exchanged a look. Over the past year, they had indeed encountered other families dealing with similar challenges, and Sarah had found herself naturally falling into an advocacy role, helping parents navigate systems and access resources. What would that look like? Thomas asked. We're thinking about a peer support network. Parents who have successfully worked through similar challenges, mentoring those who are currently struggling. Combined with professional services, but with the personal understanding that only comes from lived experience. Sarah felt excitement building as Helen outlined the program. I'd love to be involved. After what we've been through, I know how important it is for families to have advocates who understand their situation. And Thomas, Helen continued, we'd like you to consider serving on the Tribal Family Services Advisory Board. Your perspective as a father who made mistakes but found his way back would be invaluable in shaping our policies and approaches. After Helen left, Sarah and Thomas found Jake and Josh surrounded by their classmates, all talking excitedly about summer plans and the upcoming school year. Watching her sons interact so naturally with their peers, Sarah marveled at how completely they had integrated into normal childhood life. Mom, Josh called out using the title that had evolved naturally over the months. Can Jake and I go to Tommy's birthday party on Saturday? His mom already said it was okay with her. Of course, Sarah replied, still feeling a warm glow every time the boys called her mom. The transition to that role had been gradual and organic, growing out of daily care, homework help, and countless conversations about their hopes and fears. As they drove home from the ceremony, Jake brought up a topic that had been on his mind lately. "Mom, Dad, we've been thinking about something. We want to do a presentation at school about our story." Thomas's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "What do you mean?" "We want to tell other kids about what happened to us," Josh explained from the back seat. "Not to make you look bad, Dad, but to help kids understand that families can go through hard times and still come out okay." Sarah turned to look at the boys. "That's a big decision. Are you sure you're ready to share something so personal?" "We've talked about it a lot," Jake said. "We know some kids at school whose parents are struggling with stuff like drinking or depression. We think knowing that other families have problems and work through them might help." Thomas pulled into their driveway and turned off the engine, sitting quietly for a moment. "You boys have grown into people I'm incredibly proud of," he said finally. "If you want to share our story to help others, I support that decision. Just remember that it becomes part of your public identity once you do." "We know," Josh said seriously, "but we're not ashamed of what happened. We're proud of how our family came back together." That evening, as had become their tradition, the family gathered on the porch to watch the sunset and talk about their day. Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment of contentment and purpose. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't found the boys that day?" she asked Thomas as Jake and Josh played fetch with the dog they had adopted 6 months earlier. "I try not to think about it too much," Thomas admitted, "but I know it wouldn't have ended well. The boys were becoming increasingly resentful of their isolation, and I was running out of ways to justify keeping them hidden." "You didn't just help us solve our problem, Sarah. You probably saved our family from complete destruction." Sarah watched Jake throw a tennis ball across the yard, his laughter carrying on the evening breeze. "I keep thinking about how afraid I was when I first came here. I thought my life was over, that I was being sacrificed for my family's financial problems. And now?" Thomas asked, though his tone suggested he knew the answer. "Now I know that sometimes the path we're forced onto leads us exactly where we need to be. I would never have chosen an arranged marriage, but I can't imagine my life without you and the boys now." As if summoned by her words, Jake and Josh bounded up onto the porch, their cheeks flushed from playing. "What are you guys talking about?" Jake asked, settling onto the porch steps. "Just about how glad we are that we're all together," Sarah replied. Josh leaned against Thomas's chair. "Dad, do you think Mom would have liked Sarah?" Thomas smiled, the question no longer carrying the pain it once had. "I think your mother would have loved Sarah, and I think she would be incredibly proud of the men you boys are becoming." "We think she would have liked having Sarah as a sister," Jake said thoughtfully. "Someone to help take care of us and make Dad happy again." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes at the boys' generous way of including her in their family narrative, making space for her without diminishing their mother's memory. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Sarah realized that the secret Thomas had carried for so long was no longer a source of shame or fear. Instead, it had become a testament to the lengths a parent will go to protect their children, and to the healing power of honesty, community support, and love. The arranged marriage that had seemed like a trap had become the foundation of a family built on mutual respect, shared purpose, and genuine affection. Jake and Josh had their lives back, Thomas had found peace and partnership, and Sarah had discovered that home isn't always the place you start from, but the place where you choose to build your future. Looking around at her family gathered on the porch of the house that had become her true home, Sarah smiled at the beautiful unpredictability of life. Sometimes the most profound transformations begin with the most unexpected circumstances, and sometimes the greatest secrets once revealed become the source of the greatest strength.